When the Carters signed the papers for the lakefront property in Macon, Georgia, they felt like they had stumbled into something out of a dream. The sprawling home overlooked Lake Juliette, the water calm and silvery beneath the morning sun, framed by thick trees that whispered with every breeze. It was exactly what Linda and Mark Carter had been searching for. A place away from the city noise. A home where they could raise their 2 children, Emma and Caleb, in peace. What they didn't mention to the children, or even fully admit to themselves, was that this was once the estate of Otis Redding, the soul legend whose voice still haunted radios and record players across America. Otis had died decades earlier in a tragic plane crash, but his legacy was deeply tied to this land. Locals still referred to the area as Otis's Place, and there was a kind of reverence whenever his name came up. On their first night in the house, Linda stood in the wide living room, the hardwood floors gleaming under the light of the brass chandelier, and listened to the quiet. It wasn't like the city quiet, which was full of muffled traffic and distant sirens. This was a silence that felt deep, pressing, almost alive. The children were upstairs, settling into their new rooms, while Mark unloaded the last of the boxes from the truck. Linda thought she could hear faint music low, wavering, like it was carried on the wind. She stepped outside onto the porch. The night was still, the lake stretching dark and endless before her. No one was nearby, no cars passing, no neighbors within earshot. And yet, the faint strains of a man's voice seemed to drift from the treeline, slow and soulful, the words too soft to make out but heavy with longing. When she mentioned it to Mark later, he laughed it off. "You're just tired. Probably someone with a radio out on a boat." But the water had been empty, Linda knew. And the sound hadn't come from the lake, it had come from the house itself, seeping through its walls. In the days that followed, small things began to unsettle them. Emma swore she heard humming when she was alone upstairs. Caleb, only 8 years old, told his parents that a man in a dark suit had stood by his bedroom door at night. Not moving, not speaking, just watching. Mark brushed it aside as imagination, but Linda couldn't shake the way Caleb described it, the detail about the man's tie, the polished shoes, the sad expression. Then came the morning when Linda walked into the living room and found the old record player. She was sure it hadn't been there the day before. Dusty, wooden, with a turntable that looked like it hadn't spun in years. A single vinyl sat on it, sleeve yellowed with age. She leaned in to read the label, and her chest tightened. Sittin' on the dock of the bay, Otis Redding. But when she touched the record, it was cold, far too cold for the warmth of the room, as if it had been left outside in the dead of winter. The record player unsettled Linda more than she wanted to admit. She hadn't seen movers bring it in, hadn't seen it in the catalog of items from the sale, and yet it sat in the living room as though it had always belonged there. When she asked Mark about it, he shrugged. Probably left behind from the previous owners. Old furniture, junk, who knows? He said, already half distracted with arranging his tools in the garage. But Linda couldn't let it go. The turntable was spotless, not coated in the dust you'd expect from years of neglect. It had a faint smell of wood polish, as though someone had recently cared for it. That evening, she found herself drawn to it again. The children were upstairs, Emma blasting music through her earbuds, Caleb on the floor with his toy cars. Mark had fallen asleep on the couch with the television flickering. Linda crouched beside the record player, her reflection warped faintly in the shiny surface of the vinyl. She didn't mean to do it. Her hand seemed to move on its own as she set the needle gently down. A soft crackle filled the room, followed by silence. Then, as if the air itself thickened, the opening notes of "Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay" began to play. Linda froze. The sound was rich, impossibly clear, as though Otis himself was singing in the room. His voice carried weight, sadness, a depth that seemed to reverberate through the floorboards and into her chest. From upstairs, a door slammed. She jumped, pulling the needle away. The record kept spinning silently. Mark stirred but didn't wake. "Mom!" Emma's voice floated down from above, trembling. "Was that you singing?" Linda didn't answer. She looked at the record player, then at the staircase. The shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should, swallowing the corners of the house. By the second week, The Carter family was no longer able to dismiss the oddities as coincidences. At night, the faint sound of humming drifted through the halls, low and rhythmic, sometimes accompanied by a soft tapping, like a foot keeping time on wooden floors. Caleb stopped sleeping in his room altogether. He came to their bed one night, pale and shaking, insisting that the man with the suit kept leaning over his bed, whispering words he couldn't understand. Emma, who was older and more skeptical, tried to rationalize everything. She joked about Otis's ghost trying to rehearse for a show, or maybe haunting them because they didn't appreciate his music enough. But her laughter didn't last. One night, she woke screaming, convinced that someone had been sitting at the foot of her bed. She described hearing breathing slow, steady, almost in tune with a melody. Mark finally confronted it head-on. He stormed into the living room late one evening when the faint strains of music grew louder than ever. He grabbed the record player, yanking the vinyl off the turntable. "Enough of this," he muttered, carrying it out to the garage. Linda thought she saw his hands trembling as he set it down. But the music didn't stop. That night, the house itself seemed to hum. The walls vibrated faintly, as if strings ran through them, carrying the deep, mournful voice of Otis reading through the plaster. It wasn't loud, it was subtle, barely audible, but it was everywhere, and no one could escape it. The turning point came on a rain-soaked afternoon. Linda was folding laundry when she noticed Caleb standing perfectly still at the window. His small hands were pressed against the glass, his eyes locked on the lake. "What are you looking at, baby?" she asked softly, walking toward him. He didn't blink. His lips moved, whispering something under his breath. "Caleb." When she touched his shoulder, he finally looked up. His face was pale, his voice hollow. "He wants us to come to the water." Linda froze. "Who?" The man who sings." A chill ran through her, sharp as a blade. She pulled him back from the window, but he resisted, his gaze still fixed on the dark water beyond the trees. For the rest of the day, he was quiet, withdrawn, humming under his breath a tune Linda recognized too well. When she told Mark, his face hardened. "That's it. Tomorrow I'm calling someone, maybe a priest, maybe the realtor. I don't care. We can't keep living like this." But Linda wasn't sure who could help. Because deep down, she had begun to feel something she couldn't explain. The presence wasn't threatening, not exactly. It was heavy with sorrow, a longing that pressed on her chest like an invisible hand. It was as though Otis Redding himself hadn't left this place, as if his music, his voice, his very spirit, had seeped into the walls and the water, refusing to let go. And now it was reaching for her family. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The storm didn't let up that night. Thunder rolled across the lake in deep, uneven bursts, shaking the glass panes in their frames, while sheets of rain hammered the roof so heavily that it felt as though the house itself were drowning. The Carters huddled in the living room, candles burning because the power had gone out just after dusk. The dim glow flickered across the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to sway and stretch with every gust of wind. Caleb sat cross-legged on the rug, staring at the record player in the corner. Mark had thrown a blanket over it earlier, refusing to even look at the thing, but Linda noticed how her son kept his gaze fixed on it as though waiting for something. Emma sat stiffly on the couch, earbuds in but no music playing. Linda knew she hadn't pressed play. She was pretending to block the world out, but her eyes darted to the corners of the room every time the house creaked. The first note was so soft Linda thought she imagined it. A low hum, barely audible under the storm, rising from beneath the blanket covering the turntable. Then another sound joined it, the distinct scrape of a chair leg against wood. Linda's head jerked toward the dining room. The table sat empty, but one of the chairs was no longer aligned with the others. It had shifted, pulled back slightly, as if someone had just taken a seat. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Mark rubbed his face, trying to disguise the tremor in his hands. "Old house, new storm. That's it." His voice was firm but hollow, lacking conviction. But Caleb suddenly looked up at them, his small face serious in the candlelight. "He's here." The words hung in the air like the lingering echo of thunder. Linda's skin prickled, a cold wave washing over her chest. She glanced at the dining table again. The chair stood still now, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something invisible sat there, watching them, listening. The next morning the storm had passed, but the house didn't feel cleansed. It felt heavier, charged, as though something had been allowed in. The family moved quietly through breakfast, avoiding the subject. Mark went out to the garage, tinkering with boxes and tools he had no interest in. Emma spent hours upstairs, pacing her room. Caleb sat at the piano in the corner of the living room, an old upright that had come with the house. Its surface chipped and keys yellowed. Linda froze in the doorway as she watched him. His small fingers moved across the keys, pressing them one by one. The sound was uneven, halting, yet the melody was unmistakable. "Dock of the Bay. Where did you learn that?" she whispered. Caleb shrugged without looking at her. "He showed me." Her throat went dry. "Who?" He finally turned his head toward her, and his voice was so calm, so certain, that it made her stomach turn. "The man in the suit." By the third week, the haunting was no longer confined to sounds and impressions. Objects began to shift. Picture frames tilted on their hooks, cutlery clattered in drawers though no one touched them. On 2 separate nights, Linda woke to the sound of footsteps moving slowly across the upstairs hall, steady and deliberate, as though someone were pacing outside the children's rooms. She would lie frozen beside Mark, unable to move, listening to the measured steps until they stopped directly outside her own bedroom door. But perhaps the most disturbing was the water. The lake had always been beautiful, its surface a mirror of the sky, but lately it had taken on a different quality. Linda would catch Emma staring out the window for long stretches, as if mesmerized. Caleb began drawing pictures of it at school, dark swirls of blue with a figure standing at the edge. Even Linda, when she walked along the dock one morning, felt an almost magnetic pull toward the water's edge, the sensation of something calling her closer. That night she dreamed of it. She stood on the dock in the moonlight, the boards slick beneath her feet, and a man's voice echoed over the water. Not singing, but speaking low and indistinct. She couldn't see him, but she could feel his presence, strong and sorrowful, as though the lake itself carried his weight. When she woke, she found her feet damp, the hem of her nightgown clinging with the smell of wet wood. Mark reached his breaking point soon after. One evening he announced, with a hard edge in his voice, that they were leaving hotel, relative's house. "Anywhere. I don't care if this was Otis Redding's house or the Pope's," he muttered, stuffing clothes into a duffel bag. "This place isn't right." But Linda hesitated. She couldn't explain why. Part of her was afraid of the house, yes, but another part felt tangled in its atmosphere, caught in its grief. She kept thinking of Otis Redding's voice, of the tragic way his life had ended so young, so abruptly, with unfinished songs left behind. Was it possible that sorrow had stained this place so deeply it couldn't leave? That night, before Mark could load the car, the record player began to spin on its own. No hand touched it, no power ran through it, yet the vinyl turned slowly, the needle dropping with a soft click. The room filled once more with Otis's voice, deep and resonant, carrying a loneliness that seemed to stretch across decades. Caleb began to hum along. Emma pressed her hands against her ears, tears running down her face. Linda stood frozen, torn between terror and pity. And Mark whispered, almost too quietly for her to hear, "Do you hear that? He's not letting us go." The Carters had lived in the house less than a month when they realized escape was not as simple as packing their belongings and walking away. Something bound them there, as though the house itself resisted their departure. The night Mark attempted to drive them out, the car refused to start. He slammed the hood shut with trembling hands, cursing, sweat beading at his temples even though the air was cool. "We'll call someone tomorrow," he muttered, forcing calm into his voice. "We'll tow it. Rent something. We're leaving." But when morning came, none of them spoke about leaving. They went through their routines silently, moving as if the weight of the house pressed on their shoulders. Linda realized then what frightened her most. The house didn't feel hostile, it felt sorrowful. Its grief was infectious, wrapping around each of them, seeping into their bones. The water was the first to claim them. One gray afternoon, Emma vanished from the house. Panic seized Linda when she couldn't find her daughter in her room, in the kitchen, or outside. She raced toward the lake, her heart pounding, and saw Emma standing barefoot at the end of the dock. Her hair clung to her face in the damp air, her arms limp at her sides. She stared out over the water, her lips moving soundlessly. Linda screamed her name and sprinted forward, grabbing her by the shoulders. Emma blinked, dazed, as though waking from a dream. "I didn't want to," she whispered hoarsely. "He was calling me." Her voice broke, and she clung to her mother's waist, sobbing. That night, Linda made Emma sleep in her bed, refusing to let her out of her sight. Yet even as she drifted into uneasy sleep, she dreamed of the water again, the dock glowing pale under the moon, a man's silhouette waiting at the far end. His voice carried across the still surface, rich and aching, no words, only longing. The next day, Mark decided to confront it. He stormed into the living room, yanked the blanket off the record player, and shouted into the emptiness of the house. "Enough! Whoever you are, whatever you want, leave us alone. You had your time here, and we have ours now." The silence afterward was suffocating. For a moment, Linda thought he had broken whatever hold lingered. Then, slowly, the record began to spin. The needle dropped without a hand touching it. Otis Redding's voice filled the room, deeper than before, vibrating through the walls. "I can't do what 10 people tell me to do, so I guess I'll remain the same." The lights flickered. A cold wind surged through the house, rattling the windows. And then Linda saw him. A figure formed in the corner, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark suit. His face was indistinct, blurred like a photograph left in the rain, but his presence was undeniable. He stood still, his head bowed slightly, as though listening to the music that poured from the turntable. Caleb whispered, "That's him." The figure lifted his head. Though no eyes were visible, Linda felt the weight of his gaze on all of them. Not anger, not malice, but grief so vast it swallowed the air. After that night, the Carters no longer questioned if they were haunted. They were. The man in the suit lingered in the hallways, on the dock, by the piano where Caleb's small fingers echoed his songs. They heard his voice in the walls, in the pipes, in the silence between storms. Mark tried calling priests, mediums, even the realtor, but none would come. Those who answered the phone spoke with a strained politeness, then found reasons to decline. One woman simply said, "That house belongs to him," before hanging up. Linda began to wonder if they had become caretakers rather than owners. The house was no longer theirs to shape, to fill with their lives. It belonged to the man who had lost everything too soon, whose unfinished songs lingered in the air like smoke. The final night came quietly. It was warm, the air heavy with the smell of rain that had not yet fallen. The Carters sat together in the living room, the record player silent but expectant in the corner. No one spoke. It felt like waiting for something inevitable. Then, without warning, the house filled with music. Not from the record player, not from any one place, but everywhere. Otis Redding's voice poured from the walls, the ceiling, the floors, rich and whole, singing with a sorrow that was almost unbearable. The sound shook the glass in the windows, made the floorboards tremble under their feet. The figure appeared again, clearer this time. The suit gleamed faintly, the outline of his face more defined. He looked at them, his presence filling the room like a tide. Linda clutched Caleb's hand, whispering a prayer she didn't believe in. The man lifted a hand, slowly, almost gently, and pointed toward the lake. The music swelled. The windows blew open, and a gust of cold air swept through, carrying the smell of deep water. The family clung to one another as the voice rose to its final note, a note that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of sound, into grief itself. And then silence. The figure was gone. The record player sat still. The house was once again quiet, empty, ordinary. In the morning, Mark insisted they leave. He didn't care if the car wouldn't start, didn't care if they had to walk. He would not stay another night. They gathered their things in silence, the children pale and hollow-eyed, Linda torn between relief and something that felt like loss. As they stepped outside, Linda turned back one last time. The house loomed over the lake, its windows dark, its walls holding secrets that would never be told. She thought she heard it then, so faint she almost doubted herself, the sound of a man humming, low and steady, carried on the wind from the water. The Carters never returned. The house remained, waiting, holding its sorrow like a song unfinished. And those who live near the lake still say that on quiet nights, when the water is calm and the wind drifts through the trees, you can hear him, Otis Redding, his voice echoing through the darkness, reminding the living that some souls never leave the places they loved most. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.